Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. I'm Ted Johnson, Director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center, and I want to make just a few notes before we get started. First, we will leave time for questions at the end of the discussion. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, please feel free to add them via YouTube and Facebook chat, okay? Second, civility is important to all of us here at the Brennan Center. Those who post rude or intemperate language in our message streams here on YouTube and Facebook will be removed from the conversation. And lastly, we provide live closed captioning. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and when necessary, defend our systems of democracy and justice. Let me hand things over to tonight's moderator, Eugene Daniels, White House correspondent and playbook author for Politico. Welcome, Eugene.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you guys for having me. Hello to all of you out there. Happy Wednesday. The contentious aftermath of the 2020 presidential election and the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th can be traced to the election disinformation spread by several officials, many of them holding elected office, one of them being then a president of the United States. Their unfounded claims of mass voter fraud and private companies complicit in rigging the election's results have come to be known as the big lie. While there's no broad constitutional right to lie, the Supreme Court has held that false statements, inaccurate information, and political speech are often protected by the First Amendment. When such speech, however, crosses the defamation, fraud, or perjury, or the lie results in an undue benefit, it is not covered by the First Amendment. So when an elected official lies intentionally to undermine our democracy or result in an unjustified electoral benefit, does that protection extend? What is the role of journalists like me, in covering big lies? And how can private corporations involved in electoral processes fight back against false political speech? I want to introduce our panelists for this discussion today. First, we have Char Torres Spelisi, a fellow at the Brennan Center and a law professor at Stetson University. Next is Catherine J. Ross, a law professor at the George Washington University School of Law and author of A Right to Lie, Presidents, Other Liars, and the First Amendment. And Katie Glenn Bass, research director at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Welcome to each of you. We have a lot to get to, so we're just going to dive right in. And I want to start with kind of a broad question that's in the title of the event so that we can lay the foundation for the rest of the conversation. Is the big lie protected by the First Amendment? I'll give you each about 3 minutes or so to address the question from your kind of area of expertise. Catherine, I want to start with you. In your book, A Right to Lie, you make the case that lies told by high-ranking officials can undermine democracy. And because of that, perhaps their speech should have certain constraints. Does the speaker of the big lie then change whether it is protected speech?
I think it should, but the Supreme Court doctrine, the current law, doesn't say that expressly. So let me back up for a minute. And I think you did a good summary of the peculiar status of lies under the First Amendment, where the court has said they do have, and here I'm talking about factual falsehoods that can be proven to be false, verifiable factual falsehoods, or what the court called straight out lies. And the court, for the first time in 2010, told us that they are not completely outside the protection of the First Amendment, which some of the other examples you gave of lies that the government can regulate, like fraud and perjury and defamation, are considered not to be protected by the speech clause. Lies, they said, are, and they gave 2 examples of what the state needs to show if they want to regulate or criminalize a bald-faced lie. And one of them, you got absolutely right, benefit to the speaker that they don't deserve. But the other one that I think is even more important when we look at lies by public officials and presidents in particular is harm to other people. And here I've argued that the harm to democracy, or the harm to what we often talk about as the body politic, And what I argue also would be harms to the American public, as with the coronavirus lies that President Trump told. And the big lie is my other example of things that are so harmful that we really cannot allow them to proceed. They could have been stopped short. And so I argue that because the president works for us, he should be treated like other government employees. And government employees do not have First Amendment rights that the rest of us have vis-a-vis their employer. So if they talk about something that can be connected in any way to their public duties, they can be fired and they don't have a First Amendment defense. And in the case of the president or certain other high government officials in the federal government, the oversight that the Constitution has in mind should be provided by Congress. And I explain step by step what the escalating forms of discipline might be. And I have some other ideas that go to other state officials, for example, and to the lawyers who lied to the court and to the public in support of the big lie.
I want to back up just a teensy bit, and I should have done this from the beginning because the topic is so interesting, the word lie. So Catherine, in one sentence, how do you define the word lie?
Great question.
What a lie is.
Yes. The legal definition of a lie is a statement that the speaker knows to be untrue. So that's an intent element. And he wants other people to believe him or to rely on what he says. I have a more stringent definition for the lies of presidents that I'd like to see regulated. And that is repeated, not just one-off, I made a mistake, I misspoke, repeated lies about material things. That means things that would change an outcome or a decision by a voter, and that endanger the body politic or the American people. So it's
Tara,
not intended to be as broad.
Tara, what about you in one sentence? What is a lie?
I think telling an intentional falsehood with the intent of having your listener believe you.
Katie?
Yeah, I think I agree with those two statements. I think there is an intent element that the person must be intending to mislead other people to get them to believe something that is false.
Yeah, which makes it difficult, right? Because it's really rare to get into someone's mind.
It's
Sometimes,
very hard to prove intent, and it's very hard to prove that someone knew that their statement was false.
Right. Tara, I want to get to your question. You recently wrote about the defamation lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Systems against media companies and individuals who accused it of facilitating election fraud. They did that throughout kind of right after the election and until this day, really. So can you tell us a bit about the lawsuits and, more importantly, how defamation can be a means of contesting false political speech?
Sure. Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. And I, too, am going to back up just a little bit. So in Citizens United, the Supreme Court asserted without proof that the appearance of influence by wealthy spenders would not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. And I think this really begs the question, what would make a significant portion of our electorate lose faith in our democracy? And I think, unfortunately, the country would find out a decade later. The calculated use of political branding techniques to devalue and cast doubt on the 2020 election through the repetition of the big lie was enough to make millions of Americans lose faith in the democratic process. Now, of course, who is saying the big lie, in what context, and to what end, all matter legally. If it's defamation or incitement, or if it's covered by the government speech doctrine, then it's outside of the First Amendment's protections. But otherwise, the big lie is protected by the First Amendment. So for example, if the big lie is being said by President Trump at the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th, then it is likely to be covered as incitement under the Brandenburg test, which does not get First Amendment protection. If the big lie is being said under penalty of perjury by a lawyer like Sidney Powell in the Michigan lawsuit known as the Kraken suit, then that is also unlikely to be covered by the First Amendment, at least according to Judge Parker, who slapped her and her co-counsel with sanctions, including paying Detroit and Michigan's legal fees, and being referred to their home bars for possible disbarment. And finally, to get to your question, if you're Fox News and you repeat one aspect of the big lie, which was that Dominion voting machines allegedly flipped votes, which gave Biden the win, and you repeat that lie again and again and again after getting cease and desist letters from Dominion's lawyers, then that may well be defamatory against Dominion voting and outside First Amendment protections. There are ongoing litigations on that front, and so we will see if courts agree with Dominion that they have been defamed. I'll stop there.
Katie, your organization defends the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital age. Thank you, as a reporter myself. The recent lawsuit brought by former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin against the New York Times suggests that courts may soon revisit protections available to the press. So what is the role of the press in fostering public discourse while also not being weaponized by those pushing false claims like the big lie?
Oh, well, yeah, I wish
question.
I had an easy answer to that. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. So, I mean, I think, to go to the Palin case for a moment, I think it's not as clear to me that courts really have that much of an appetite for revisiting our current protections for the press. We have had 2 justices on the Supreme Court indicate that they're open to revisiting Sullivan, but 2 is not 5. Of course, this court is extremely unpredictable in some ways. But I think, there is a very well-established body of law on press freedom. And I think certainly the Palin case was not the case that was going to blow that up. It was just not a very strong lawsuit. The role of the press, I mean, more broadly, I think one thing that comes to mind immediately for me is the amount of soul searching that I have seen journalism do since the 2016 election in terms of thinking about the way they cover certain issues and the way they frame certain issues. I think there's already been a tremendous amount of effort made to be very thoughtful about that and to be very thoughtful going forward based on a perception that the way press coverage, mainstream press coverage, focused on the 2016 election was unhelpful to the outcome and not necessarily assigning the appropriate weight of harm or danger to the stories that they were covering. So I think there's already been a tremendous amount done in the past 6 years now by members of the press to be more thoughtful about that and also to diversify the press corps itself and make sure that different viewpoints are involved in covering these stories and trying to bring them to people's attention. But the press's job ultimately is to report on what is newsworthy. So it's not necessarily their role to steer the public to or away from a particular opinion.
Yeah. We're going to get into these questions all together. So have a freewheeling conversation. So kind of get in where you fit in. As you've all addressed, there are ways of constraining big lies. If they can be proved defamatory, if they incite violence, they are clearly not protected. That much is clear. We know that after the Supreme Court case Alvarez v. United States, in which a man's false claims that he was a Medal of Honor recipient were determined by the court to be protected speech, Congress then passed a revised version of the Stolen Valor Act that added the stipulation that such speech was unlawful if it intended to gain some benefit of thing of value by making a fraudulent claim. But when is a benefit considered undue and who makes that determination? And also, is this sufficient protection to prevent big lies going forward? Charles, I'll start with you.
So with Alvarez, Alvarez really bugs me because the Supreme Court decides that this guy who claims that he has won an honor that he has not won, and he is turned in by a female Marine, and he is prosecuted under the Stolen Valor Act, and his defense is, I have a First Amendment right to lie and puff up my own resume if I feel like it. And the Supreme Court essentially agrees with him in a plurality. And that has opened the door to the Supreme Court also ruling in a case called Dry House that lying in elections is also okay. And I think that's the background that allowed Trumpism to run wild.
I have to disagree respectfully with that analysis of Alvarez. Alvarez was not a very nice guy. He was a habitual liar. His own lawyers told the court he lies about everything all the time. He can't help himself. And while he made a sort of ridiculous argument, or one that seemed ridiculous at the time, the government also made a very broad and argument that was really hard to support. This was the first case under the statute that made it illegal to lie about these honors. And the government said, lies are just outside the protection of the speech clause. We can regulate any lies we want to. They're completely valueless. And they relied on what lawyers called obiter dicta, which are passing comments and opinions that are not actual holdings of the court. And the government convinced, and this is very important, there were 3 dissenters. And the dissent was written by Justice Alito, who is very much on our minds this week, because we've been talking for the last 48 hours about his draft opinion overturning abortion, which may or may not turn out to be the actual opinion. But what Alito thought as a dissenter really matters to what the next outcome would be should another case, or when another case about lying reaches the court. So the plurality said, Alvarez's lie really didn't hurt anybody, and he didn't get any benefit from it. So I want to compare it to another case that was on its way through the federal courts at the time, which is a good answer to Eugene's excellent question. So there was another guy who lied about having received military honors, but he set up a fake charity and he collected money saying he was going to use it to help veterans. This isn't the first scheme like that. We've heard other schemes like that since. And had his case reached the Supreme Court first, there would have been demonstrable harm for which there are legal remedies. He defrauded people, and he harmed others by defrauding them, and he benefited himself by taking money he did not deserve. So I think that is a much stronger case for enforcing a law against lying.
Katie, what about you?
Yeah, so I try to separate these into 2 separate questions, or buckets of questions, as I am thinking through these difficult issues. So the first is there a constitutional justification for prohibiting certain kinds of lies? I agree that Alvarez is a difficult opinion, and the government maybe could have argued it differently. Alvarez, the idea that you might want to prohibit stolen valor types of lies, there's a much clearer connection to me there between the harm that you are trying to prevent and the remedy in the form of the prohibition. When it comes to things like the big lies, I have a harder time. I can see colorable, often very compelling arguments that the big lie harms democracy, that it undermines citizens' faith in government, all of those things. I find those compelling rationales. I am less certain the court would find those compelling. This court does not seem to be particularly sympathetic to those sorts of arguments. But is it, even if we could get the court to agree to that, is a prohibition on the big lie, or on more generally on falsely alleging that an election was rigged, is that a good remedy for the harms that we are worried about here? Do we believe that if we were going to legally prohibit people from claiming that an election was rigged, that would foster more confidence in our electoral system? I am not sure that it would. Maybe if we could go back in time and enact a law like that in 2014 or 2015, but at the point in time where we are, it seems to me that the government acting in that way now would simply hand a whole new sheaf of ammunition to the kinds of people who want to undermine the system and point out, well, look at this. They don't even want us to talk about this. What are they hiding from you? What don't they want you to know? I personally think it would backfire quite profoundly. And I also think, I would also like to know if we're confident that that kind of law would only be applied against the kinds of people we're worried about. What about people who talk about Russian interference in the 2016 election? What about people who talk about voter suppression and extreme voter suppression being a form of rigging an election? Are we confident that we could draw a law that would aim at the one and not the other? I am not.
Yeah. Katie, I agree with you. I do think that the kinds of, as a political reporter and constantly talking to folks about this, especially over the last year and some change, it doesn't feel like a law like this, us implementing a law like this would all of a sudden everyone starts acting right? Everyone starts telling the truth about the election, because the incentive structure in the United States government and in our electoral process doesn't lend that space. And I guess I'm curious for both Catherine and Chara, what do you think about the idea that Katie just lined out, that, whether or not a law would come out right now, whether that would actually give more of an issue for all of us who care about the big lie, want it to stop and think it's bad for democracy, or that it would, actually get people to start doing things right in the right way?
I think that's a really valid concern. I've seen some reports from focus groups and reporters who say that many of the individuals, the average citizens who believe in the big lie and who are agitating based on it, agitating and worse, say that the more they hear officials and mainstream press tell them that they're wrong, the more they are convinced that there is a conspiracy, and it just cements their concerns. But I think we also need to talk briefly, before we delve too far into the solutions, into why the First Amendment is understood to protect lies under Alvarez, because I was very surprised by the decision in Alvarez. I didn't expect it. And it is important in terms of the First Amendment principles. So the first is the essential principle that the government has no power to suppress expression because of its message, its content, or its viewpoint. And in order to identify a lie and say, we're going to punish it or prohibit it, you need to talk about its content, its message, and its viewpoint being that something is true or false. Also, that debate on public issues has to be robust. That is a key to democracy and uninhibited. And people shouldn't be prevented from saying even very outlandish things. And finally, to determine what is a lie, someone has to make that decision, and someone has to enforce the laws against lying. And that comes smack up against the central prohibition of the speech clause, which is that the government cannot restrict or judge or determine what people will say. And in a series of decisions, not just in Alvarez, both in the plurality and in the dissent, but many lower courts have said if the government has to decide what is true or false, it becomes George Orwell's Ministry of Truth, and that is absolutely forbidden. So we need to figure out what we would do even if we had these laws. Could we agree on what a lie is? And could we find a mechanism that doesn't make the government the supreme censor and judge of everything we say? And those are really hard practical problems.
Chara, I guess I'm curious for you, kind of in the same vein. These concerns of giving the government too much power over determining what's true and what's false in speech, right? That feels like something that, on its face seems very concerning for folks, and especially those of you that are lawyers in the audience and on the panel. So I guess, what's your response to that?
So I'm in the middle of writing a piece right now where I compare.
Perfect. Give us a little preview.
I compare how the court talks about perjury. So the court itself is very self-protective. It does not want people coming into court, either in filings or in live testimony, and lying to them. And so they penalize lying in court. And I feel like we need some sort of similar mechanism to protect our democratic process, because this free-for-all of, large and small lies just running rampant, and there being no ability to punish it is, I think, like we've disarmed ourselves in a weird way. So I'm just going to go back to Dry House for just a moment. So in this case, there was a anti-choice group, and they're called the Susan B. Anthony List. They put out ads that lied about the voting record of a congressman. And they ran afoul of a Ohio law that made it a crime to lie about the voting record of a candidate or political office holder, which he was both. And when this is being litigated, the Susan B. Anthony list raises a very Alvarez-like argument that they have the right to lie and the government cannot be the arbiter of truth. And the end result of that is it goes up to the Supreme Court, it goes back down, and the lower courts invalidate that Ohio statute. Like, I, for one, would be happy with having that style of statute where the question is a politician's voting record. They've either voted yes or no on budgets. They have voted yes or no on bills. And so I think having some ability to police those types of lies would be useful to the electorate.
Mm-hmm. For those in the audience, we haven't forgot about you. Please submit questions for the panelists. We'll go to those questions next, but I have at least one or maybe two more questions before we do. Charles, something you said kind of sparked a question in me about the, what I often hear from folks nowadays, both Democrats and Republicans, is that we're kind of in a 5-alarm fire when it comes to democracy right now, right? And so we can't do the things that we've been doing, right? We have to be maybe more creative. We have to be a little bit more aggressive in policing some of these things, with the caveat that it also provides a lot of free speech and constitutional issue concerns in that conversation. So I guess for the three of you, when it comes to how precarious our democracy feels right now, how far should we all be willing to go? Katie, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, for me, I'm not sure it's a question of how far we should be willing to go. So here is how I see it. We are in a 5-alarm fire for democracy, and it's really scary. It's a dark time out there. I think we got to that 5-alarm fire over decades. I don't think this is something that started in 2016. I think this is the result of decades of campaigns to undermine public institutions, campaigns to undermine faith in the media, all sorts of declining trust in public institutions. There are a lot of factors that have coalesced to create this giant cesspool of a moment we're all living through. And as a result, the solutions, if you can even call them solutions, I think of them more as ways forward, are not going to be fast and are going to be kind of a slog. I think, to give some background for a moment, the Knight Institute just hosted a symposium on lies, free speech, and the law, where we invited a number of scholars to write papers for us about this very question, about lies in politics and public discourse, and how we should think about those and what we can do about those. And Catherine was kind enough to moderate one of those panels. One of the things that struck me about the discussions we had that day is that most of the ways forward that people were identifying didn't have to do with the First Amendment, and actually didn't have that much to do with the law. They had much more to do with structural remedies, with political solutions. It's notable that we're going through this crisis in the midst of the breakdown of the news media ecosystem and their traditional sources of funding, especially local news. And it's not easy to restore or replace local news architecture, but it's not impossible. It's not impossible to work on building more public-minded digital platforms for discourse. It's not impossible to think about new institutions that we might develop for the making and dissemination of knowledge. It's not impossible to think that we can mobilize the 20 to 30% of Americans who don't vote in most elections, about how we can make them feel that the political system, can make their lives better, that participating is worth their time. They're not fast fixes, and I understand that they don't feel particularly satisfying, because some of this is going to be the work of a lifetime and beyond. But that is where our discussions tended to center, was that sort of long-term grinding it out kind of work.
Yeah. Char, what about you on this question?
Man,
I know, how much time do we have?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was a lawyer at the Brennan Center for 6 years. I've been a fellow, I think, for 9. This is what we work on day to day. Like, how do you make a healthier democracy where more people engage. And Katie is exactly right. The biggest political party are unregistered voters. And if we could engage with them, I wonder whether we would get certain different political results in our polity. And I hate where I'm landing on this, because my father was an artist. I love the First Amendment and the ability to communicate, but I also feel like the marketplace of ideas way of looking at truth and lies is not working. The lies are winning. And so I am struggling with how we sort of get back to center, if that's the metaphor, where truth is more valued and easier to find and accessible to more people.
Catherine, what about you?
I agree with both Jara and Katie. I agree with Katie that it is not enough to deal with the question that's on our mind today. We need to do some structural, both energizing and reforms to build up our democracy. And I agree that if anything ever proved that the marketplace of ideas, which for the lay people in the audience is the idea that the solution to bad speech is more and better speech, if anything ever showed that that is simply a fantasy or a nice organizing principle, it's the tenacity of the big lie, which has not only been tenacious, but is spreading and multiplying. So you used the term a 5-alarm fire. I would say it's a hair on fire moment. And it is tied to people who not only, there are more people today who believe that elections cannot be fair and accurate than there were right after January 6th. They're in both parties, but they're not equally distributed. We have to be very honest in saying that this is a partisan problem, because it is the Republican Party, even knowing that this is not true. And we now know from judicial findings that President Trump knew the lie was a lie. When he told it, his lawyers knew it was a lie. And more people are believing it. And a significant proportion of them also think that the big lie entitles them to be violent in seeking to overturn election results. And as one of the political scientists who studied this said just a month or so ago, this is like dry kindling during the fire season, and it's set to go off. So I don't know, and I'm really not usually an apocalyptic person. I am a careful law professor, but I don't know that we have the time for those structural changes, and particularly given what the Republicans are doing, building on the big lie. And here the Brennan Center has made a great contribution. It collects data on who's running for statewide offices, particularly governors and secretaries of state this year. Obviously, those aren't up for election in every state. But there are 27 states electing secretaries of state this year. And you may recall, secretaries of state have a big role in who gets those presidential delegates. And in 19 of those 22 states, there are election deniers running on the Republican ticket for Secretary of State in either the primary or the general election. And if election deniers fill those offices and the governorships, then I think all bets are off. So it is a very frightening moment, and one that calls for prompt action, even if the prompt acts aren't the only ones we need to engage in.
It sounds like we all would kind of take intervention by the federal government off the table in a bit in this sense. So what role should private companies play in ensuring elevated public discourse, whether there are companies like Dominion, media companies that oversee much of the traditional press, or social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook? And further, since the Constitution lets states determine the time, manner, and place of holding elections, are there actions that the individual states can take in absence of federal intervention? Katie, I'll start with you.
I mean, in terms of what the private sector can do, the platforms, the major social media platforms, have been trying, or at least claim they have been trying, to curb election disinformation on their platforms. The effect of that, first of all, the extent to which they've actually been doing that is difficult to track, especially on platforms that don't share much data with researchers. But the effect of that, I think, is also a little difficult to track in terms of how much traction it's had. Because I think one of the things that, just to go back to, this is not easy, there are no satisfying solutions. If you look at the social science that has been done on what makes people more likely to buy into a conspiracy theory or a false claim, it's not the kind of situation where you just see something online and then you read it and then you believe it. The way people form their beliefs and opinions is more complicated than that. The kinds of people who are susceptible to conspiracy theories tend to have more underlying personality traits that make them more likely to believe those sorts of things. So it's not necessarily, it's not to remove responsibility from the platforms. I think they have a lot to answer for, but it may not be as simple as pulling stuff down. There may be more work that needs to be done here.
Tara, what should some of these individual states be doing? Are there actions they can be doing in absence of federal intervention?
Well, I think one of the frustrating things to watch as someone who works on democracy is Republican governors and Republican legislatures have used the big lie as an excuse. So their line is something went horribly wrong in the 2020 election. Therefore, we should have more restrictive voting rules. And that has metastasized, and the Brennan Center has done an excellent job of cataloging and litigating and trying to push some of that back. But states don't have to fall for the big lie. You can do things to expand the electorate, to make voting easier. Automatic voter registration is one. If we could just get election day to be a holiday, that would make it easier for working class voters to vote. I mean, there's so many just small changes that would improve our electoral system. But unfortunately, states are going the other way. They're making it harder to register. They're rejecting more absentee votes. It's just like we are going down entirely the wrong path right now.
Yeah. Catherine, I'll let you have the last word on this one.
Thank you. I want to build on what Chiara just said. So the question you ask assumes that states want to do the right thing. But we know that many states want to do exactly the opposite. And it's not just that they're using the big lie to justify these restrictions on voting. In many instances, they're saying, we know the big lie isn't true, but because some people believe it, we ought to respond to that belief so that they will feel better about our electoral system and electoral integrity. So they're not even pretending that there was a problem before, and they're just transparently and publicly building on the lie, which is extremely concerning.
We have some audience questions. Thank you guys so much for submitting them. So we'll go to those. The first question is, does the recent leak from the Supreme Court cast doubt over their ability to decide issues of truth? Shout out to my colleagues for that story. Who they're not here, but they're fabulous and a big, historic leak there for the American people. Tara, I'll let you take this one.
Well, I think we shouldn't.
I'm giving you all the easy ones. All three of you. I'm just giving you easy questions. I'll even along.
Yeah. So one thing to just remember is this leak is almost unprecedented. I don't think I've ever seen a full draft opinion come out of the Supreme Court. The closest we got was during the Affordable Care Act litigation. There was a rumor that John Roberts had switched sides, which he actually did, but that's about it. So because one case leaked, I don't think that that necessarily means that the Supreme Court is incapable in the future of being a judge of truth. As I said, the court is very serious about policing perjury. And I think they still have the ability to do that. Whether they will is a different question.
Mm-hmm. Katie, can intent to lie be proven by any number of litigations that former President Trump's lawyers filed and lost?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the question of whether Trump and the people in his inner circle intended to lie and intended to mislead people about the way the election was conducted is not so difficult to prove. I would also point out that the number of lawsuits we've seen, both defamation lawsuits by Dominion, voting systems, and then also some of the efforts to enact professional disciplinary procedures against some of the lawyers who were involved in those cases, suggest that there are other mechanisms of pushback that are already in progress, that are already working without needing to create new legal mechanisms. But yes, I mean, I think there is quite a lot of evidence that Trump and his inner circle knew that they were misleading people, and I think also the work of the January 6th committee, that the investigatory committee in Congress is doing everyone a great service by revealing more information about what people knew and when they knew it and what they were trying to do.
At any point, if I ask a question to someone and you have something to add, please feel free to jump in. It's now clear that some Supreme Court justices may have lied in their confirmation hearings about Roe v. Wade and whether or not it was super precedent, as it was often put. Is that free speech, Catherine?
It's extraordinarily disturbing. And I would add to the people the sitting justices who lied about their respect for precedent, the unresolved issue about Justice Thomas, not just the current issues surrounding the activities of his wife, but the strong suspicion that he perjured himself at his confirmation hearing. So we now have at least a third of the sitting justices who are suspected perjurers. And I think that really cuts to the legitimacy of the court. I don't think that there is much that can be done about it, though people talk about impeaching the justices. Then we have a court that is completely decimated. The court has no enforcement powers. It issues opinions, and it relies on the strength of its influence and respect for the institution for those rulings to take effect. And so we need a healthy Supreme Court. And that, I think, would have to be a program for another night. But we have seen the increasing politicization and voting on straight party lines on a number of really important issues, not just abortion, but perhaps most important in our context tonight, voting rights, decimating the Voting Rights Act, and stepping back from examining things like gerrymandering, which a court is absolutely capable of doing. So this is a very important question, and one that I really don't know how to resolve if we're not going to go to something like expanding the court, which has many political ramifications and which the reform study did not recommend.
Right. Should it be up to social media companies to police free speech on their platforms, or should the government step in? Chara.
Well, it's not great for the government to step in because of the First Amendment.
Yes.
Yeah, and moreover, and we saw this with a law that my home state of Florida tried to do. Yeah. So they were annoyed at the deplatforming of President Trump by Twitter and Facebook. And so they passed this law that regulated or tried to regulate the choices to deplatform and content moderation on the part of platforms. Though weirdly, that particular legislation had an exemption for Disney. Disney and DeSantis have fallen out of love since then. But in the courts, it was sort of a no-brainer that this violated the First Amendment because of the compelled speech doctrine, which is another doctrine we haven't quite gotten to yet. So the government cannot compel you to say the Pledge of Allegiance. It can't compel you to have live free or die on your license plate. And in this context, it can't tell the social media giants how to moderate the content that is on their own platforms.
With the doubt in the media increasing, who should tell the public what is true or false, Katie? Very simple question, right?
Well, I mean, to some extent, I think that it's up to the public to determine what is true or false. I don't know that anyone else can do that for them after a certain point. One thing that tends to come up when we're having conversations about the current sorry state of affairs and scary state of affairs is I often notice there's an assumption underlying the conversation that things used to be better in our information ecosystem, that things were better before and now they are worse. And I really wonder sometimes what is the moment people have in mind when they are thinking about the time when things were better. There was a time when we had far more gatekeepers on what information the public got access to, and the angles in which certain stories were covered. There were 3 major news networks. And I'm not sure anyone is advocating that we go back to something like that, although I think people are realizing that gatekeepers to some extent played a useful role. But we're now in a period where, as chaotic as it is and as much false information and lies are floating around, we're also having a more inclusive experience of public discourse than I think this country has ever had before. It is easier for more people, and for people who look and think and feel differently and have different life experiences can all participate in the public debate in a way that was not true before. And we're seeing some really negative effects of all of that, but we're also seeing some really positive effects.
Yeah. Catherine, what should be, or should there be a penalty for an elected official blatantly lying? Someone that we, let's say they say something and, they say, oops, I messed up. We as reporters pointed out to them, and they keep on spreading that same thing, knowingly lying. Should there be a penalty, and what should it be?
That's a great question, and it's a really hard question. The traditional answer was the penalty is in the voting booth, going back to what Katie said, this is up to the people. But sometimes the people don't care. And that may sound a little paternalistic for me to say, but a lot of them are saying, we don't really care. So if the lies are really harmful, like the big lie is, I think we ought to be looking for a way. And I have actually worked with some members of Governor Inslee's staff and some legislators in the state of Washington to try to think about ways that would comply with the First Amendment. And one would be to say, and this is not happening this year, but I'm still thinking about it, and it's in early stages, but what if we made it a condition of running for office that the candidates have to say they will not engage in the big lie once the results of an election are clear, have gone up through all the challenges that the law provides, including recounts and judicial review, and the results are certified? Then if you want to play the game, you have to agree to listen to the umpire's calls. And I think that is perfectly reasonable. Going beyond that, it is much harder to regulate political lies because you have to really narrowly define what those are. And I want to go back to something Chiara said much earlier in our conversation about the Dry House case. So there are 16 states that still have statutes on the books, even after Alvarez, saying that they want to regulate campaign laws. And the problem is they're not well crafted as a rule. So they say, any lie likely to affect the outcome of the election, or any lie about your opponent, whether it's material or not, or can be disproven. And even things like a voting record can be very hard to establish. If you'll remember, during John Kerry's campaign, where the Republicans were saying he voted for it before he voted against it, because things come up, and they come up in what we call omnibus bills that have lots of things in them. And maybe you vote no because you don't like other things in the bill. These truths and untruths are not always so easy. And people also engage in a lot of manipulation of their speech to make their lies deniable.
Char, what is the line between lies versus manipulation versus spin? Because for me as a reporter, right, I deal with all three in different ways, right? I will call the White House, and a press secretary will try to spin something bad that happened, or something that President Biden may have said, into something positive. They may try to trick me into coming onto their side, or this has not happened with this White House that I'm aware of with me, or they may lie to us and try to convince us not to write. So what's the line between the three of those?
Yeah, I don't think there are legal definitions that we can point to between lies, manipulation, and spin. I did want to bring in the Kelly case, which is the Bridgegate case. So there we have Bridget Ann Kelly lying about closing the lanes to the George Washington Bridge. And the Supreme Court basically exonerates her and throws out her conviction. And one of the things that I find so frustrating with what the Supreme Court has done with liars is they give them basically a free pass. And they have these punts to the electorate. In Kelly, the Supreme Court said, the upshot is that federal fraud law leaves much of public corruption to the states or to their electorates to rectify. And the rub is here that if the electorate is disabled from holding a corrupt public official accountable at the ballot box, if they have no idea what the elected official has done. And the reason why I'm so concerned about elected officials and others in the government lying is that mostly they're going to lie to hide their own corrupt acts. And that's what keeps me up at night, that we haven't figured out a way to square this circle.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that keeps bouncing around in my head as we're having this conversation is, and Catherine, especially kind of what you write about in your book, is if people have more power, if they continue to gain more power in society, they should be, at least me as a reporter, I believe that they should be held to a higher accountability, right? We check in on them, different folks are paying attention to them, different watchdogs. But does that also mean that they get to enjoy less of the First Amendment, less of some of the rights that citizens, normal citizens enjoy because of the amount of power and sway and influence they hold? Catherine, I'll start with you.
Thank you for that question. In the second impeachment trial in the Senate, President Trump's lawyers argued, absolutely mind-boggling to me, they argued that he has more First Amendment rights than anyone else because he's the president and he can say whatever he wants. So first of all, my understanding of the First Amendment is that it is so robust. It is intended to protect us so much that why would anyone need more First Amendment rights than you and I have? So the argument in itself showed no understanding of the First Amendment. But I would say to the contrary, because as you said, the impact of a president's influence on public opinion and his ability to spread his lies, to have them multiply and be animated by other people is such that they can do more harm than the lives of any other person in the country. I mean, arguably, you might say there are some Hollywood celebrities who have as much influence, but I don't think we would take their lies as seriously. So, yes, I think when you run for public office, you are exposing yourself to greater scrutiny. It's one of the reasons that in defamation law, we say there are special protections for speakers who are accused of defaming public figures. And because one of the most important parts of the First Amendment is to allow all of us to criticize the people who are in power. So yes, the press should be focusing on the lies and corruption, which is hardly new, of public officials. They should expect that, and we should be able to hold them accountable in some way, which we're still struggling to figure out. And here again, the death of local media, of local journalism, is a huge problem for democracy, because as Chara said, people can't vote based on what they don't know. And if no one is covering the state house or the municipal government, we don't have well-informed voters. And without well-informed voters, we are not a functioning democracy.
Katie, how about you quickly on this question?
I actually was going to say almost essentially what Catherine said, that to me, this comes back to local news and to the erosion of local news networks, also sort of the nationalization of politics. I mean, there's no longer an understanding that your particular representatives are meant to focus on your area and your region's needs. Everything has become a national issue and a national battle, and everybody's voting for their team and not the other team, regardless of their personal interests or local interests. But it also, going back to the local news point, when it comes to institutions that people have faith in, when you see all of these surveys and polls asking if people trust the media and the numbers are so dismally low, I think that sort of elides a little more nuance that's really happening there, in that almost everybody has a news source that they trust, and often that is a local news source, or was, until that local news source disappeared. So I don't think it's the case that the media as a whole is completely untrusted. It's there are windows there are cracks and things that we can lever, but I do think we need to think very seriously about how we shore up local news and rebuild some of these structures.
Chara, quickly, if you have anything to add here.
Oh man, the confirmation bias problem is a real problem. We seek out opinions and news that confirms what we already believe, which then hardens what we believe, because we are under the misimpression that everyone thinks like we do. And this allows Americans to live in these information silos where they don't understand that not everyone thinks like them. Other people disagree, and they don't even understand the basis on which another person disagrees with them. It's a real problem.
Yeah. Our last question of the night, we're running up on time. Thank you all so much for sticking with us. The midterms have already basically started, right? We're in the middle of the primary season. 2024 will be here before we know it, which is sad, but true. With that in mind, what is the one thing you want our viewers to walk away with tonight? I'll start with you, Catherine.
Thank you. The one thing I hope our viewers will remember from this evening is that the enormous harm that lies by presidents and other high officials is so damaging to democracy that we need to find constitutional ways to hold them accountable more than we hold other liars to account.
Katie?
Sorry. The one thing that I hope that tonight's viewers will take away is that the public is not the problem. The public is the solution. I think there is understandably a great fear of populism and of what the right is doing with populism. But what the right calls populism isn't really, mobilizing the full public. It's the mobilization of an aggrieved minority of that public. And the key, as far as I can tell, for fighting back against that is to fight for a truly inclusive democracy, as Chara was saying earlier. That means fighting to make it easier for everyone to vote and easier for everyone to participate in our public debate and discourse in whatever way they choose.
And Char, lastly to you, what is the one thing you want our viewers to walk away with tonight?
What I would like our viewers to walk away with tonight is that they need to be their own fact checkers. Don't fall for something just because you've heard it 100 times. Diversify your media diet, read broadly, think for yourself.
Our thanks to all of the audience for watching and for sending your questions. I wish we had time to answer them all and answer all of the other questions I had as these amazing, interesting women were speaking. I'm Eugene Daniels. Thank you for all coming and supporting the work of the Brennan Center for Justice. Have a good night.